Before there was a Russia, there was simply the plain, an immense, unbroken stretch of forest and grassland running from the Baltic coast in the west to the Ural Mountains in the east, with almost nothing in between to stop an army, a raiding party, or a hard winter wind. No mountain range interrupted it. No natural wall marked where one people's land ended and another's began. Historians have long pointed to this basic fact of geography as the starting condition for everything that followed, a homeland with no edges, inhabited by peoples who had no way to seal themselves off from whoever came next. By the 8th and 9th centuries, that plain held a patchwork of communities rather than a single people. East Slavic tribes had settled along the river valleys, farming, fishing, and trading in small clusters. To their north and east lived Finno-Ugric peoples, hunting the deep forests for furs. To the south, on the open steppe, nomadic horsemen moved with the seasons. And for generations, one steppe power in particular, the Khazar Khaganate, had extended its authority over a wide arc of the eastern Slavic tribes, extracting tribute from them in furs, silver, and sometimes people. This was not a relationship of neighbors. It was a relationship of the taxed and the taxing, and it left the Slavic communities of the river valleys with a long, uneasy familiarity with paying to be left alone. That familiarity did not translate into unity among themselves. The tribes fought one another as readily as they paid tribute outward. There was no shared court to appeal to, no common law that bound a dispute in one village to a ruling in another, and no standing force capable of putting down a feud before it spread. A later chronicler, writing in Kiev generations afterward, recorded a folk memory of this period in blunt terms. The tribes had no law among them. One rose against another, and the fighting became so constant that some of them eventually resolved to send word overseas, asking a Varangian people to come and rule over them, since their land was rich but held no order. That story, preserved in what is known as the Primary Chronicle, is the closest thing the era has to an origin narrative, and it should be read carefully rather than literally. Modern historians remain divided over how much of it reflects an actual invitation and how much reflects later monks constructing a tidy founding myth to justify a ruling dynasty's legitimacy. This is often called the Normanist controversy. One camp of scholars, following the chronicle closely, sees the Rus state as substantially a Scandinavian import, organized from outside by Viking traders and warbands. Another camp argues the Slavic and Finnic communities of the region already had their own emerging structures of authority, and that the Varangians were absorbed into a process already underway, rather than starting it from nothing. The debate has never fully settled, and both readings agree on one point. Whoever initiated it, the outcome was the same. What is not in serious dispute is who the Varangians were and what drew them there in the first place. They were Scandinavian traders and raiders, cousins in culture and language to the Vikings who were, in these same decades, harrying the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and Francia. But the plain offered something the Western raids did not: a river system. The Volkhov, the Western Dvina, and above all the Dnieper, formed a connected water route running from the Baltic Sea in the north down to the Black Sea and the gates of Constantinople in the south, broken only by a handful of overland portages where boats had to be dragged between rivers. Along this route moved amber, furs, wax, honey, and enslaved captives heading south, and silver, silk, wine, and manufactured goods heading north. Byzantine sources of the period describe northern traders arriving at Constantinople's walls in fleets of hollowed log boats, seeking not conquest, but market access and formal trading privileges. Controlling that route, rather than any single stretch of farmland, was the prize worth organizing for. Whoever held the key points along the Dnieper could tax every boat that passed, and it was at the southernmost of those key points, a hilltop settlement called Kiev, that Varangian leaders eventually established a fortified base and began extending their authority over the surrounding Slavic and Finnic tribes. The details of exactly how this happened, and over what span of years, are thin and contested, but the broad shape is agreed on: a small, well-armed, mobile group of outsiders, positioned themselves astride an existing trade corridor and converted control of commerce into control of people. This should not be pictured as a conquest of an unwilling population by a hostile foreign army. It functioned, in its early stages, closer to a protection arrangement. The Varangian prince and his armed retinue, known as the Druzhina, offered local communities a shield against raiding neighbors and predatory steppe tribute collectors, and in exchange, the communities supported that retinue with food, lodging, and goods, a practice later termed kormlini, meaning literally feeding. It was not law in the sense of written statutes, but it was order of a kind, and for people who had lived for generations under the alternating threats of tribal feud and outside tribute demands, even a crude and self-interested order represented an improvement worth accepting. The scale of what existed in these earliest decades should not be overstated. Kiev, in the 9th century, was not yet a capital of anything resembling a state in the modern sense. It was a fortified trading post with a garrison, ringed by satellite settlements, extracting tribute from tribes that in some cases lived a considerable distance away and had little day-to-day contact with the prince who claimed authority over them. Byzantine and Arab travelers' accounts from the period, imprecise as they are, describe a northern trading people organized loosely around fortified river towns, numbering their armed retinues in the hundreds or low thousands, rather than anything approaching a national force. Tribute collection itself, described in later chronicles as an annual circuit called polyode, involved the prince and his retinue physically traveling from settlement to settlement each winter to gather what was owed, because no administrative system yet existed to do it for him. The arrangement that took hold along the river route did not stay scattered among competing chieftains for long. Tradition places the turning point with a Varangian leader named Rurik, who established himself at Novgorod, a fortified settlement in the north, commanding the upper end of the trade corridor. The chronicle record around Rurik himself is thin, and some historians treat him as much a symbolic founder as a documented historical actor. But what happened after his death is on firmer ground. His successor, a warlord known as Oleg, moved south along the river system with an armed force and took Kiev by force from two rival Varangian chieftains who had been holding it independently. That single move mattered more than any battle detail that survives about it. For the first time, the northern end of the route, at Novgorod, and the southern end, at Kiev, answered to the same ruler. Oleg is said to have declared Kiev the mother of Rus cities, and whether or not the line itself is authentic to him, the sentiment reflects what actually happened administratively. Kiev became the seat of a single princely line, with Novgorod and the string of river fortresses between them functioning as subordinate posts, feeding tribute and manpower toward the center. This consolidation transformed what tribute collection meant. Where the earlier Polyuda had been a prince and his retinue traveling a limited local circuit, Oleg's Rus now claimed authority over tribes spread across a much larger stretch of territory, including Slavic groups who had previously paid tribute to the Khazar Khaganate to the south. Byzantine and Arab sources from the following decades describe Rus traders and raiders operating with growing confidence, and in 907, and again in 911, Oleg is recorded as having led a Rus expedition against Constantinople itself, extracting a formal trade agreement that granted Rus merchants the right to trade in the Byzantine capital under specified terms, including a monthly allowance of provisions and defined limits on how many could enter the city armed at once. The treaty text, preserved in the primary chronicle, is treated by most historians as substantially genuine, since its administrative detail set quotas of bread, wine, and meat for Rus traders, restrictions on their movement within the city, requirements that they carry identifying seals, matches known Byzantine diplomatic practice of the period far too closely to be a later invention. It matters because it shows something new. Within a generation of Kiev's seizure, the Rus princes were no longer simply a local power extracting tribute from nearby tribes. They were treated as a foreign power worth negotiating with by the wealthiest empire in the region. Oleg's successors, extended the pattern of southern ambition, with mixed results. Igor, ruling after him, led another campaign against Constantinople in 941 that ended in disaster. His fleet destroyed by Byzantine ships using an incendiary weapon known as Greek fire, a closely guarded formula that burned even on water, and that Rus chroniclers remembered with evident horror. A second expedition 3 years later produced a renewed treaty on terms less generous than Oleg's, suggesting the balance of power had shifted back toward Constantinople after the earlier defeat. Igor's reign ended violently as well. Sent to collect tribute a second time in a single season from a tribe called the Drevlians, he was killed by them. An episode later, chroniclers treated as a caution against demanding tribute beyond what had been agreed. His widow Olga, ruling as regent for their young son, responded in a manner the chronicle recounts in stark and violent detail, including a series of retaliations against the Drevlians, culminating in the burning of their principal town. Whatever the literal accuracy of the account, which historians generally treat as embellished in its specifics while accepting the broad outline of a harsh reprisal, its lasting significance lies elsewhere. Olga is credited with formalizing tribute collection into fixed rates and designated collection points, called pogosti, replacing the old traveling circuit with something closer to a set administrative system. This was a quiet but consequential shift, converting an arrangement that had depended entirely on the prince's physical presence into one that could function, at least partially, without him. Olga took a further step whose consequences would outlast every military campaign of her era. She traveled to Constantinople and was baptized into Christianity, becoming the first ruler of Rus to formally adopt the faith, even though the wider population and her own son remained committed to the old gods. Her conversion did not immediately spread through Rus society, and her son, Sviatoslav, when asked to follow her example, is recorded as having refused, reportedly on the grounds that his retinue would mock him for abandoning the gods they still honored together. But her decision planted a precedent and a personal connection to Constantinople's court and church that later rulers would draw on directly. Sviatoslav himself represented a different kind of ambition altogether, one oriented almost entirely outward and southward, rather than toward consolidating what had already been won. He is described in Byzantine and chronicle sources alike as a warrior prince with little interest in Kiev as a seat of governance, campaigning instead against the Khazar Khaganate and effectively breaking its power as a regional force, then pushing into the Balkans with ambitions, according to some Byzantine accounts, of relocating his own capital there entirely, closer to the wealth and trade of the Byzantine world. This overreach drew Byzantine military response, and Sviatoslav was eventually forced to withdraw from the Balkans, under negotiated terms, killed shortly afterward, according to the chronicle, by Pecheneg nomads, who ambushed his retinue on the journey home. The son who emerged from that succession contest was Vladimir, and his path to Kiev was not a clean inheritance, but a hard-fought seizure, involving the killing of one of his own brothers, and years of maneuvering with hired Varangian muscle, before he secured the throne outright. Once in power, Vladimir's first instinct was not toward the new faith his grandmother had adopted, but toward the old one. He is recorded as having erected a set of pagan idols on a hill above Kiev, including one to Perun, the thunder god favored by the warrior retinue, in an apparent attempt to unify the old Slavic pantheon into a single state-sponsored cult, with himself as its patron. That experiment did not last. Within several years, Vladimir reversed course entirely, and the chronicle account of why he did so has become one of the most quoted passages in the entire Rus historical record, even as historians treat much of its detail as legend layered over a genuine event. The story holds that Vladimir sent envoys to investigate the major faiths available to him: Islam, Judaism, Latin Christianity, and Byzantine Christianity, and that his envoys returned unimpressed by the others, but overwhelmed by their experience at a Byzantine liturgy, reporting that they no longer knew whether they were in heaven or on earth. So great was the beauty of what they had witnessed. Whatever actually happened in any embassy, The decision Vladimir reached had a far more concrete and calculated dimension than a tale of aesthetic wonder suggests. Byzantine Christianity offered something Islam and Judaism, as practiced by neighboring powers, did not: a direct alliance route into the most sophisticated and wealthy court in the region, sealed through marriage. Vladimir negotiated to marry Anna, sister of the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, an extraordinary concession from Constantinople's perspective, since Byzantine princesses were rarely given to rulers of what the imperial court still regarded as a peripheral, semi-barbarian people. In exchange, Vladimir provided Basil with a force of Rus warriors to help suppress a rebellion threatening the emperor's own throne, and agreed to be baptized himself. The baptism, conventionally dated to 988, was followed by mass conversions ordered from above rather than arising from popular demand. Chronicle accounts describe the population of Kiev being led into the Dnieper River to be baptized en masse, and the wooden idols Vladimir had erected only years earlier being dragged down and thrown into the same waters. Resistance to the new faith persisted for generations in outlying regions far from Kiev's direct authority, and some historians caution against reading the chronicle's triumphant account of instant, total conversion too literally, since folk religious practice blended with Christian observance for a very long time afterward in the countryside. What conversion delivered, regardless of how gradually it took root among ordinary people, was a set of institutions Rus had never possessed before. Byzantine clergy arrived with a written Slavic liturgy based on the alphabet earlier missionaries had developed for Slavic-speaking converts elsewhere in Europe, giving Rus, for the first time, a functioning written language tied to religious and administrative use. Church courts brought a body of law dealing with marriage, inheritance, and morality that operated independently of princely whim, and an ecclesiastical hierarchy, headed by a metropolitan appointed from Constantinople, gave Kiev a permanent institutional link to Byzantine learning, architecture, and statecraft that no purely secular alliance could have provided on its own. Vladimir's reign also marked a turn toward defensive consolidation, rather than the outward campaigning that had defined his father's rule. Chronicle sources describe him constructing a series of fortified towns and earthen ramparts along the southern approaches to Kiev, intended to blunt raids from Pecheneg nomads on the steppe, and populating these frontier defenses with settlers drawn from across his territories, rather than relying solely on the old Varangian retinue structure. This represented an early, if crude, attempt at something like territorial administration, organizing the state's defense as a standing system rather than a series of ad hoc responses to whichever threat appeared that season. Vladimir's death in 1015 produced a succession struggle among his numerous sons that dragged on for years and included fratricide on a scale that shocked even chroniclers accustomed to violent transitions of power. Two of Vladimir's sons, Boris and Gleb, were murdered by agents of a rival brother, Sviatopolk, and their deaths, in which both are recorded as having accepted their fate without resistance rather than raise arms against their own kin, led to their canonization as the first native Rus saints, a development of real significance since it gave the young Christian state its own homegrown models of piety, rather than relying entirely on saints imported from the Byzantine or Latin tradition. The eventual victor of this fratricidal contest, Yaroslav, who came to be remembered as Yaroslav the Wise, presided over what most historians treat as the high watermark of Kievan unity and cultural achievement. Under his rule, Kiev's Cathedral of St. Sophia was built, modeled deliberately on its namesake in Constantinople, and the city's population and physical footprint grew to a scale that impressed foreign visitors. One Western European chronicler who visited Kiev in this period reportedly described it as rivaling Constantinople itself in size, a comparison modern historians treat with some skepticism, but which nonetheless indicates how the city appeared to outsiders at its peak. Yaroslav's most consequential act of governance, though, was neither a building project nor a military campaign, but a legal one. The compilation of a written law code known as the Russkaya Pravda, the earliest surviving native legal text of the Rus state. It set out specific compensation payments for injury and death, according to social rank, procedures for resolving property disputes, and rules governing debt and inheritance. And while later princes expanded and revised it, its core represents the first attempt to replace custom and princely discretion with a fixed, written standard applied consistently across Rus territory. Yaroslav also used marriage alliance on a scale that reveals how far Rus had risen in less than a century. His daughters married into the royal houses of France, Hungary, and Norway, and his own marriage connected him to Sweden's ruling family, giving Kiev diplomatic threads running across nearly the entire breadth of Christian Europe. This was not the marriage politics of a peripheral frontier power seeking protection, but of a state confident enough in its own standing to be sought out as a partner by ruling houses far from the Dnieper. The rotational succession system Yaroslav left behind did not simply produce occasional disputes. Within 2 generations, it had fractured Rus into a shifting collection of rival principalities, each ruled by a branch of his descendants, and each willing to ally with steppe nomads against fellow Rurikid cousins if it served immediate advantage. By the 12th century, chroniclers were recording princely coalitions attacking Kiev itself with a regularity that would have been unthinkable in Yaroslav's day. The city was sacked by rival Rus princes in 1169 and again in 1199, each time by armies drawn substantially from other Rus territories rather than foreign invaders. Kiev's prestige as a symbolic capital did not disappear, but its practical authority over the wider Rus lands had effectively dissolved. Out of this fragmentation, power shifted toward regional centers that had once been peripheral. Novgorod, in the north, developed a distinctive political arrangement in which a merchant-dominated assembly, known as the Vecher, held real authority over taxation and even over which prince to invite or expel, reducing princes there to something closer to hired military commanders than sovereign rulers. In the northeast, in a heavily forested region, historians refer to as Susdalia, a different pattern took hold. Princes there, less bound by old Kievan aristocratic families, built personal power more directly, founding new fortified towns, including one first mentioned in the chronicles in 1147 under the name Moscow, at the time nothing more than a minor fortified outpost with no particular significance. This process of regional consolidation might, left to its own pace, have eventually produced a smaller number of stronger, more coherent Rus states. It was interrupted instead by a threat arriving from a direction no Rus prince had previously needed to take seriously: the eastern steppe, where a Mongol confederation under Genghis Khan had, within a single generation, subdued an area stretching from northern China to the Caspian region, absorbing or destroying every steppe and settled power in its path. A first limited encounter came in 1223, when a Mongol reconnaissance force, pursuing a rival steppe people called the Cumans, met a combined army of Rus princes and their Cuman allies at the Kalka River. The battle ended in a catastrophic defeat for the Rus coalition, with several princes killed and the survivors routed, but the Mongol force withdrew eastward afterward, without pressing the advantage further, and the episode was treated by Rus chroniclers less as a warning of what was to come than as an unusual, isolated disaster, a reading that later events would expose as a serious miscalculation. The full weight of Mongol conquest arrived 13 years later, under a different commander entirely, Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, leading a force, historians estimate, with real uncertainty attached to any specific figure, at somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 mounted warriors, organized with a discipline and logistical coordination no Rus principality could match. Beginning in 1237, this force moved systematically through the northeastern Rus lands, and the city of Ryazan was the first to face its full method. After the city refused Batu's demand for tribute and submission, it was besieged, stormed, and according to chronicle accounts, its population massacred, almost in its entirety, a fate the chronicler records in language meant to convey total devastation rather than precise arithmetic. The pattern repeated across the region with grim consistency over the following months. Vladimir, Suzdal, and Moscow itself, still a minor town at this stage, were each taken and burned in turn, and the Grand Prince of Vladimir, Yuri II, was killed in battle attempting to organize resistance along the Sit River in early 1238. One notable exception in this campaign was Novgorod, which the Mongol force approached to within roughly 100 kilometers before turning south, a decision historians attribute most plausibly to the spring thaw, making the surrounding marshland impassable for cavalry, sparing the city a fate its southern neighbors did not escape. After a pause, the Mongol campaign resumed southward in 1239 and 1240, and it was Kiev, the ancient symbolic heart of the entire Rus world, that bore the campaign's final and most devastating blow. The city fell in December of 1240, after a siege chroniclers describe in stark terms, and a papal envoy named Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, traveling through the region several years afterward on a mission to the Mongol court, recorded finding the city reduced to only a small number of surviving houses, with countless skulls and bones of the dead still scattered openly across the ground where he passed. Archaeological excavation in the 20th century, uncovering mass burial pits and burn layers dated to this period beneath the modern city, has broadly corroborated the chronicle's account of catastrophic destruction, even where exact population and casualty figures remain impossible to establish with confidence. What followed the conquest was not annexation in the manner Mongol forces applied elsewhere in their empire, absorbing conquered territory directly into administrative provinces. Rus princes were, in most cases, left in nominal control of their own territories, required instead to travel to the court of the Golden Horde, the Western Mongol successor state that now claimed authority over the conquered lands, to receive formal confirmation of their right to rule, a document known as a yarlik, along with a fixed obligation of tribute owed annually to the Khan. This arrangement, later termed the Tatar yoke by Rus chroniclers and by generations of historians afterward, preserved the outward form of princely rule while subordinating its substance entirely to Mongol approval and taxation. The psychological and cultural impact of this defeat is difficult to overstate, and chroniclers of the period make little effort to disguise it. Rus religious writers of the following decades frequently framed the conquest as divine punishment for the sins of princely infighting and fratricide that had fractured the Rus lands in the preceding century, an interpretation that served, whether intentionally or not, to draw a direct moral line between the earlier era's disunity and the catastrophe that disunity had left the Rus principalities unable to resist. That transformation began, unglamorously, with tribute collection, rather than any battlefield triumph. Among the princes competing for the Golden Horde's favor in the decades after the conquest, the line ruling Moscow found a method that set it apart from its rivals. Rather than merely paying what the Khan demanded, its princes made themselves indispensable to collecting what everyone else owed as well. The prince most associated with this shift, even the first, ruling in the early 14th century, earned the nickname Kalita, meaning money bag, a label chroniclers applied, with a mix of scorn and grudging respect. In 1327, the city of Tver, Moscow's principal rival, rose in revolt against a Mongol tax official and his retinue, killing them in the streets. Ivan did not join the revolt. He marched alongside a Mongol punitive force sent to crush it, helping to devastate Tver's territory in exchange for the Khan's favor, and returned to Moscow with an enlarged tribute-collecting authority over rival principalities that Tver's ruin had left vacant. This pattern, collaboration rewarded with expanded administrative reach, defined Moscow's rise far more than open military resistance to Mongol authority did. Ivan Kalita secured the right to collect tribute on the Horde's behalf across a widening circle of Rus territories, skimming a portion for himself in the process, and used the wealth this generated to buy land, fund construction, and draw the Orthodox Metropolitan's permanent seat to Moscow itself, a move that gave the city a religious authority to match its growing fiscal one. By the later 14th century, Moscow's accumulated resources allowed a different kind of prince to emerge, one willing to test Mongol authority directly rather than simply administer it. Dmitry, later remembered as Dmitry Donskoy, assembled a coalition of Rus princes and, in 1380, met a Mongol force under a commander named Mamai at Kulikovo Field. Winning a victory, chroniclers celebrated as the first time a unified Rus army had defeated the horde in open battle. The celebration proved premature. 2 years later, a different Mongol Khan, Tokhtamysh, marched on Moscow itself and burned it to the ground, restoring tribute obligations in full. Kulikovo's lasting significance was symbolic rather than immediately practical, a demonstration that Mongol power was not invincible, even though decades of continued subordination followed it. Real independence came gradually through the 15th century as the Golden Horde itself fractured into smaller, rival khanates, no longer capable of the unified enforcement that had once compelled every Rus prince's obedience. It was Ivan III, ruling from 1462, who presided over the moment historians treat as the yoke's formal end. In 1480, Ivan's army and a Mongol successor force under Khan Akhmat faced each other across the Ugra River for weeks, without either side committing to battle, until Akhmat, his supply lines strained and a rival power threatening his own rear, withdrew. No decisive clash occurred, yet Rus tribute payments to the horde ceased afterward and were never fully restored, giving the episode, retrospectively, the weight of a turning point despite its anticlimactic character on the ground. Ivan III's reign extended far beyond that one confrontation. He absorbed Novgorod outright in 1478, dismantling its vetch and forcibly relocating portions of its merchant elite to break the city's independent political tradition permanently. And he brought Tver, Moscow's old rival, under direct control as well. Through marriage to Sophia Paleologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, following Constantinople's fall to the Ottomans in 1453, Ivan connected Moscow's ruling house to Byzantine imperial prestige, at the precise moment that prestige had lost its living empire, and Moscow's churchmen began, in the decades following, to describe the city in terms borrowed directly from that inheritance, as a third Rome, destined to carry forward what Constantinople's fall had extinguished. That grandson was Ivan IV, and he came to power as a child, under circumstances that shaped his later reign as much as any deliberate policy did. His father, Vasily III, died when Ivan was 3 years old, and his mother, who initially governed as regent, died 5 years later, amid rumors, never conclusively resolved, of poisoning. What followed was nearly a decade of boyar factions, rival noble families, seizing control of the child ruler's court in turn, looting the treasury, and, according to Ivan's own later recollections, treating him with open contempt inside his own palace. Whatever the precise accuracy of Ivan's memory of this period, he referred back to it repeatedly in later life as the source of his lasting distrust of the boyar aristocracy as a class. Ivan was crowned in 1547, not merely as Grand Prince, the title his predecessors had held, but as Tsar, a term derived from Caesar, and carrying with it the imperial weight Moscow's churchmen had spent the preceding decades cultivating through the Third Rome idea. The title itself was a statement. Ivan intended to rule as an emperor, answerable to no council of nobles, not merely as first among a class of hereditary princes. The first half of his reign gave little hint of the violence to come. Ivan convened an assembly of the land, the Zemsky Sobor, in 1549, drawing together representatives beyond the narrow boyar elite, issued a revised law code the following year that expanded on his grandfather's Sudebnik and pursued a reform of local administration intended to curb the arbitrary power provincial governors had exercised over their districts. Militarily, this period produced Moscow's most significant conquests since Ivan III's reign. The Khanate of Kazan fell in 1552 after a prolonged siege, and the Khanate of Astrakhan followed 4 years later, bringing the entire length of the Volga River under Moscow's control and opening the way, over subsequent decades, towards Siberian expansion. The turn came gradually through the 1560s, driven by a combination of personal loss, war, and mounting suspicion that hardened into something approaching institutionalized paranoia. Ivan's first wife, Anastasia, whose family connections had helped stabilize his early reign, died in 1560, and Ivan came to believe, without conclusive evidence, but with lasting conviction, that she had been poisoned by boyars hostile to her influence over him. That same decade, Moscow became entangled in the Livonian War, a prolonged and ultimately unsuccessful campaign to secure access to the Baltic coast. And as the war dragged on without resolution, Ivan grew increasingly convinced that boyar commanders were betraying his campaigns from within. A suspicion sharpened dramatically in 1564, when Prince Andrei Kurbsky, one of Ivan's own senior generals, defected to Lithuania and began a bitter written correspondence with the Tsar, accusing him of tyranny. Ivan's response to this accumulating sense of betrayal was without precedent in Rus governance. In December of 1564, he abruptly departed Moscow for a fortified estate outside the city, and from there sent word that he intended to abdicate entirely, blaming the boyars and clergy for treachery so severe he could no longer bear to rule over them. This was, most historians agree, a calculated maneuver, rather than genuine intent to step down. Moscow's populace, terrified at the prospect of being left without a Tsar amid ongoing war, begged him to return, and Ivan agreed, but only on the condition that he be granted absolute, unrestricted authority to punish traitors, as he alone saw fit. What resulted was the oprichnina, a policy dividing the realm into two parallel jurisdictions, beginning in 1565. One, the Zemshkina, left under nominal boyar and traditional administrative control, and the other, the oprichnina proper, placed under Ivan's direct personal rule and policed by a new corps of servitors, the oprichniki, who dressed in black, rode with a dog's head and a broom lashed to their saddles as emblems of their mandate to sniff out and sweep away treason, and operated with a license for violence against anyone Ivan designated an enemy that no previous Rus institution had ever possessed. The oprichniki's campaigns escalated from targeted executions of individual boyar families into something approaching indiscriminate terror. Entire noble households were executed, along with their servants and dependents. Land was confiscated wholesale and redistributed to oprichnina loyalists, and in 1570, Ivan turned this apparatus against Novgorod itself, still one of Rus's wealthiest cities, on suspicion, never substantiated by any surviving evidence, that its elite was conspiring to defect to Lithuania. The resulting massacre, conducted over several weeks, is recorded by contemporary chroniclers, foreign and domestic alike, in accounts describing victims driven into the frozen river and drowned in the hundreds daily. Modern historians treat the specific death tolls transmitted by these sources as almost certainly exaggerated by the standards of the period's rhetorical conventions, while still accepting that the underlying event was a mass killing on a scale unprecedented in Rus civic life. The son who inherited Ivan's throne, Fyodor, was widely regarded, by contemporaries, foreign envoys included, as gentle-natured but poorly equipped for governance, and real authority, during his reign, passed to his brother-in-law, a capable boyar named Boris Godunov, who managed the state's affairs in practice, while Fyodor occupied the title. When Fyodor died in 1598, without an heir, the male line of Rurik's dynasty, unbroken in some form since the 9th century, ended entirely, leaving Rus without any agreed hereditary claimant to its throne for the first time in its recorded history. Boris Godunov secured election as Tsar through the Zemsky Sobor that same year, an arrangement that gave his rule a veneer of institutional legitimacy, but left him without the deep hereditary claim that had underpinned every previous Tsar's authority. His reign began competently, continuing administrative reforms and expanding fortifications along the southern frontier, but it was overtaken almost immediately by catastrophe, entirely outside his control. a succession of crop failures beginning in 1601, driven by unusually cold and wet summers, that modern climatological research has linked to a major volcanic eruption, disrupting global weather patterns that year, produced a famine of a severity Rus chroniclers described as unlike anything within living memory. Contemporary accounts, foreign and domestic, recorded grain prices rising many times over within a single year, city authorities in Moscow organizing mass burials for the destitute poor who had flooded in from the countryside, seeking food that did not exist there either, and instances of the starving resorting to eating bark, hay, and, according to some horrified witnesses, even human flesh, an allegation historians treat cautiously, as likely reflecting genuine desperation rather than literal universal practice, but indicative nonetheless of a famine perceived by those living through it as apocalyptic in scale. Estimates of the resulting death toll vary enormously and remain fundamentally uncertain, but some contemporary and near-contemporary sources suggested as much as a substantial portion of the population in the worst affected regions may have perished, a figure modern historians regard as almost certainly inflated, yet still indicative of catastrophic mortality. Boris Godunov's government responded with grain distributions from state reserves and price controls, but these measures proved wholly insufficient against a disaster of this scale, and popular suspicion, fed by the irregular circumstances of his election and by long-standing rumors that he had orchestrated the earlier death of Ivan the Terrible's youngest son, Dmitry, in mysterious circumstances at Uglich in 1591, curdled into a conviction among many ordinary people that the famine itself represented divine punishment for an illegitimate ruler occupying a throne he had no right to hold. It was into this atmosphere of mass suffering and simmering delegitimization that a man claiming to be that same murdered Prince Dmitry, alive after all, emerged from Polish territory in 1604 with a small mercenary force and a claim to the throne that historians have never been able to identify conclusively, referring to him simply as the first false Dmitry. Whatever his actual origins, widely suspected by contemporaries and later historians alike to have been a defrocked monk named Grigory Otrepev. Though this identification remains disputed, his claim found startlingly fertile ground among a population already primed to believe Boris Godunov's rule was cursed, and Polish and Lithuanian nobles, sensing opportunity to extend their own influence into Rus affairs, backed his campaign with troops and funding. Boris Godunov died suddenly in April of 1605, before the crisis could be resolved by force, and his young son, proclaimed Tsar in his place, was overthrown and murdered within months, as Moscow's garrison and population, exhausted by famine and persuaded by the pretender's claim, opened the city to the first false Dmitry instead. His reign lasted less than a year, undone by his own marriage to a Polish Catholic noblewoman and the visible presence of Polish soldiers and customs at his court, which alienated Moscow's population and clergy on religious and nationalist grounds simultaneously, and he was killed in a popular uprising in May of 1606, his body reportedly displayed publicly, and later, according to some accounts, fired from a cannon toward Poland in a final gesture of repudiation. What followed was not stabilization, but deepening chaos. A boyar named Vasily Shuisky seized the throne amid the unrest, but his authority was contested almost immediately by a second pretender, historians' second false Dmitry, backed by a fresh wave of Polish and Cossack forces, and by widespread regional rebellions, including a major peasant and Cossack uprising, led by a figure named Ivan Bolotnikov, that, for a time, besieged Moscow itself. Sweden and Poland, watching Rus institutions collapse into competing factions with no stable central authority to negotiate with, each intervened directly, and Polish forces succeeded in occupying the Moscow Kremlin itself in 1610, installing, at least nominally, the Polish king's own son as a candidate for the Rus throne. The nadir of this period, remembered afterward as the time of troubles, arrived with foreign soldiers garrisoned inside the symbolic heart of the state, Ivan III, and Ivan IV had spent generations centralizing, and with no Rus faction strong enough on its own to expel them. Resistance, when it finally coalesced, came not from any surviving noble claimant, but from a coalition organized outside the traditional court entirely. A merchant leader from Nizhny Novgorod named Kuzma Minin, who organized funding and provisions, and a prince, Dmitry Pozharsky, who commanded the resulting volunteer militia. Together they marched on Moscow and, after a prolonged siege, forced the Polish garrison to surrender in the autumn of 1612, a moment later commemorated with a public monument to Minin and Pozharsky that still stands in Red Square. With Moscow retaken but no agreed ruler in place, a Zemsky Sobor convened the following year, drawing delegates from across the surviving Rus territories, in an assembly broader than any that had preceded it, and after extended deliberation among various noble candidates, settled on a 16-year-old with a genuinely tenuous but workable connection to the old dynasty through marriage. Mikhail Romanov, whose election in 1613 ended the interregnum and founded a dynasty that would rule the state, in various forms, for the following 3 centuries, inheriting a realm so devastated by war, famine, and foreign occupation that its most urgent task was not expansion or reform, but simply reconstructing the basic apparatus of governance from something close to total collapse. Mikhail Romanov's early reign depended less on the young Tsar's own initiative than on his father, Filaret, a former boyar who had been forcibly tonsured as a monk during the time of troubles, and who, upon returning from Polish captivity in 1619, was installed as Patriarch of Moscow and effectively co-ruled alongside his son until his own death in 1633. Filaret's dual authority, spiritual and secular power concentrated within a single family, helped stabilize a state still recovering from the near-total institutional collapse of the preceding decade, and reconstruction proceeded gradually. Tax registers were rebuilt, provincial administration re-established, and Rus armies reorganized along lines increasingly borrowed from Western European military practice, with foreign officers hired to train and lead newly formed infantry regiments. The reign of Mikhail's son, Alexei, beginning in 1645, produced the 2 developments that would shape Rus society and religious life for generations afterward, and neither originated as a deliberate reform so much as an attempt to solve an immediate, practical problem that then escaped its original scope entirely. The first was legal and social. Peasant mobility, already restricted since Ivan III's 15th century law code, had been narrowed further across the subsequent century through a series of piecemeal decrees extending the window during which fleeing peasants could be legally reclaimed by their landlords. In 1649, Alexei's government issued a comprehensive new law code, the Sobornoye Ulozhenie, that eliminated any statute of limitations on recovering runaway peasants entirely, binding peasant families and their descendants permanently to the land and landlord under which they were registered. This single provision converted what had been a gradually tightening set of restrictions into full hereditary serfdom, a condition from which, in practice, escape became possible only through flight to the empire's frontier regions, where state authority remained thin enough to offer at least temporary refuge. The second development was religious, and it proved, in the near term, considerably more destabilizing to the state than serfdom's codification. Patriarch Nikon, appointed to head the Rus Church in 1652, with Alexei's strong personal backing, undertook a program of liturgical reform intended to bring Rus religious practice into closer alignment with contemporary Greek Orthodox texts and ritual, correcting what Nikon and his supporters regarded as errors that had crept into Rus religious books through centuries of manual copying. The changes themselves were, on their face, narrow. The number of fingers used in making the sign of the cross, the spelling of certain sacred names, minor adjustments to liturgical wording. The response among a substantial portion of the Rus clergy and laity was anything but narrow. Opponents of the reforms, who came to be known as Old Believers, regarded Nikon's changes not as harmless correction, but as a corruption of the true faith Rus had inherited at its founding, and their most prominent leader, the archpriest Avakum, wrote extensively and defiantly against the reforms from exile, insisting that the old rituals alone preserved authentic salvation and that Nikon's innovations amounted to spiritual treason. The resulting schism, the Raskol, split the Rus Orthodox Church permanently. Old believer communities faced escalating persecution over the following decades, including forced exile to remote regions. And in some documented instances, entire congregations chose mass self-immolation rather than submit to the Reformed Church, a phenomenon that continued sporadically for years afterward, and that later Rus writers treated as a haunting expression of how deeply religious identity was bound up with resistance to state-directed change. Nikon himself did not survive his own reform politically. His ambition to elevate patriarchal authority above the Tsar's own, a claim Alexei was never willing to accept, regardless of their earlier partnership, led to his formal deposition in 1666, even as the liturgical reforms he had championed remained permanently in force. Alongside these upheavals, Alexei's reign also absorbed a major territorial expansion, whose consequences would reverberate for centuries. In 1654, following a Cossack rebellion against Polish rule, led by Bohdan Khmelnytsky, the Cossack hetmanate of the Dnieper region accepted Rus protection under an agreement, the Treaty of Pereyaslav, whose precise terms and intended permanence historians continue to debate, with some reading it as a limited military alliance, and others as an act of full incorporation. Whatever its original intent, the practical effect drew the Rus state into prolonged war with Poland-Lithuania over the following years, and, by war's end, secured Rus control over Kiev itself, restoring, after 4 centuries of separation, under Mongol devastation and subsequent Lithuanian and Polish rule, direct possession of the city where the entire Rus political tradition had first taken shape. Alexei's reign closed with the state larger, its peasantry more thoroughly bound, its church permanently divided, and its administrative and military institutions increasingly shaped by borrowed Western European models, even as its court ceremony and religious self-image remained rooted in the Byzantine-derived vision even the Third generation had first articulated. This tension between an increasingly Western-modeled state apparatus and a still traditional court culture resistant to foreign influence in matters of dress, custom, and social hierarchy, would not remain balanced for long. It fell to Alexei's youngest surviving son, a boy who spent much of his childhood watching, from a place of genuine physical danger during a violent uprising of the palace guard, the brutal costs of dynastic instability firsthand, to resolve that tension by force, dragging the Rus court and elite into a program of change so abrupt and so total that it would come to define, more than any single event before or since, the turning point around which the entire subsequent history of the state would be measured. That boy was Peter, and the violent uprising he witnessed as a child, in 1682, saw members of the palace guard, the Streltsy, storm the Kremlin amid a succession dispute following his father's death, hurling several of Peter's own relatives from a palace balcony onto raised pikes below, while the 10-year-old looked on. For the following years, Peter shared a nominal joint throne with his half-brother Ivan V, while his older half-sister Sophia governed as regent, and Peter himself was largely excluded from court life, spending his adolescence instead in a village outside Moscow where he organized mock military companies among local youths and befriended foreign merchants and craftsmen living in Moscow's so-called German Quarter, an experience that gave him an early, unfiltered exposure to Western European technology, dress, and manners that his predecessors had encountered only at a formal, controlled distance. Peter assumed full personal authority in 1689 after forcing Sophia into a convent, and from the outset his ambitions were oriented outward, towards securing the sea access Rus had lacked since its founding, centuries earlier, along an open, landlocked plain. An early campaign against the Ottoman fortress of Azov in 1695 failed for lack of a proper navy. Peter's response was to build one from nothing within a single year, and a second campaign in 1696 succeeded, giving Rus its first outlet, however modest, onto the Black Sea. What followed distinguished Peter from every ruler before him. In 1697, he departed the country himself, traveling incognito through the Holy Roman Empire, the Dutch Republic, and England, as part of what became known as the Grand Embassy, working personally as a laborer in Dutch shipyards to learn naval construction firsthand rather than relying on second-hand report. No previous Tsar had left Rus territory to study a foreign power's methods directly, and the journey's abrupt end, cut short by news of a fresh Streltsy revolt in Moscow, only sharpened Peter's resolve. He returned in 1698 and suppressed the uprising with a severity that included personally overseeing interrogations and executions, and he marked his return, according to multiple contemporary accounts, by seizing scissors and cutting off the long beards of assembled boyars himself, a symbolic act he formalized shortly afterward into a tax on beards for anyone wishing to keep one, a small but deliberately humiliating assertion that the old visual markers of Rus traditional identity would no longer be tolerated at his court. The reform program that followed touched nearly every institution the preceding Romanov century had built. Peter replaced the old Boyar Duma with a Senate answerable directly to him, reorganized central administration into a system of colleges modeled on Swedish practice, and imposed a table of ranks in 1722 that based noble status and advancement on state service rather than hereditary lineage alone, allowing men of lower birth to rise through military or civil accomplishment in a manner the old aristocratic order had never permitted. He also brought the church fully under state control, abolishing the patriarchate after the incumbent's death in 1700 and eventually replacing it with a holy synod, a government department in ecclesiastical form, ending permanently the kind of independent spiritual authority Nikon had once tried to assert against the throne. None of this came without a staggering human cost, most visibly in the founding of Peter's new capital. Beginning in 1703, on marshland recently seized from Sweden at the mouth of the Neva River, Peter ordered the construction of St. Petersburg, conscripting laborers by the tens of thousands from across the empire to drain swamp, drive pilings, and raise a European-style city from ground many contemporaries considered barely habitable. Mortality among these conscripted workers, from disease, exposure, and the sheer brutality of the labor, was severe enough that later folklore described the city as built on bones, a phrase modern historians treat as rhetorical exaggeration of a genuine and considerable death toll rather than literal fact. In 1712, Peter formally relocated the capital there from Moscow, physically wrenching the seat of Rus power away from the city that had anchored it since Ivan Kalita's era, toward a newly built window facing directly onto Western Europe. The war that made this new capital secure, the Great Northern War against Sweden, consumed most of Peter's reign, beginning disastrously with a crushing defeat at Narva in 1700 that saw a far smaller Swedish force rout Peter's army entirely, and culminating, after years of reorganization and renewed campaigning, in a decisive Rus victory at Poltava in 1709 that broke Swedish military power permanently and marked, in the judgment of most historians, the moment Rus displaced Sweden as the dominant power in the Baltic and Northern European region. The war formally concluded in 1721 with the Treaty of Nystad, confirming Rus control over the Baltic coastline Peter had spent his reign fighting to secure. And it was in the aftermath of this victory, that same year, that Peter had himself proclaimed emperor, and the state itself formally renamed the Russian Empire. The scale of what Peter had accomplished, and the violence with which he had accomplished it, are inseparable in the historical record. He personally interrogated and, by some contemporary accounts, participated directly in the torture of his own son and heir, Alexei, suspected of conspiring with opponents of the reforms, and Alexei died in prison in 1718 under circumstances that remain disputed, with some sources suggesting death from torture-related injury, and others attributing it to the shock of formal condemnation alone. Population and taxation records from the period, though imprecise by modern standards, indicate that the burdens of Peter's wars, conscription, and construction projects fell overwhelmingly on the peasantry and serf population, whose obligations expanded substantially over his reign, even as the nobility above them gained new avenues for advancement through the table of ranks. The decades immediately following Peter's death did little to answer the question his reign had left open, producing instead a rapid succession of rulers, several installed or removed through palace guard intervention rather than orderly succession, a pattern later historians would label the era of palace coups. It was into the tail end of this instability that a minor German princess, born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, arrived in Russia in 1744 to marry the awkward, unpopular heir to the throne, converting to orthodoxy and taking the name Catherine, a marriage that would prove disastrous personally, but that positioned her, 18 years later, to act when the moment came. Her husband, ruling briefly as Peter III, alienated the court and the military establishment within months of taking the throne in 1762, most damagingly by withdrawing Russian forces from a war against Prussia on terms widely seen as a humiliating betrayal of gains already won, and by openly favoring Prussian military customs over Russian ones in front of his own guard regiments. Catherine, with the backing of guards officers and her own lover among them, moved against her husband within months of his accession. He was deposed and days later died in custody under circumstances contemporaries and subsequent historians alike have generally treated as murder, though the precise chain of responsibility was never established with certainty. Catherine's seizure of power left her, a foreign-born usurper with no hereditary claim of her own, in a position not unlike Boris Godunov's over a century and a half earlier, and she moved deliberately to secure legitimacy through accomplishment rather than lineage. She corresponded extensively with Enlightenment thinkers in France, presenting herself abroad as an enlightened reformer, and in 1767 convened a legislative commission drawing delegates from across the empire's social classes to consider reforming Russian law along principles drawn partly from Montesquieu, an initiative that produced extensive debate, but, in the end, no lasting new law code, dissolved without formal conclusion when war with the Ottoman Empire intervened. That gap between Catherine's cultivated image as a philosopher empress and the realities of governance she actually pursued widened further in response to the largest peasant uprising the empire had yet experienced. Beginning in 1773, a Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev, claiming to be Catherine's murdered husband Peter III, somehow still alive, rallied Cossacks, serfs, and various non-Russian peoples of the Volga and Ural regions into a rebellion that, at its height, controlled a substantial swath of territory and threatened Kazan itself, before imperial forces finally crushed it in 1775, capturing Pugachev and executing him publicly in Moscow. The rebellion's scale and the ease with which serf resentment had translated into mass armed revolt hardened rather than softened Catherine's subsequent policy toward the peasantry, and the years following saw serfdom's obligations extended further, including into newly acquired southern territories where it had not previously existed. Catherine's reign is remembered above all, though, for territorial expansion on a scale rivaling Peter's own transformation of the state a half-century earlier. Wars against the Ottoman Empire in the 1770s and again in the 1780s secured Russian access to the Black Sea coast directly, including the annexation of Crimea in 1783, ending the independent existence of the Crimean Khanate, itself a lingering successor state of the old Golden Horde, whose raids had troubled Russian and Ukrainian territory for centuries. Grigory Potemkin, Catherine's close advisor and reported secret husband, oversaw much of this southern expansion and the settlement of the newly won territories, a program later popular memory would exaggerate into stories of hollow, staged Potemkin villages, built purely to impress Catherine on inspection tours, a characterization most historians now regard as substantially unfair to the genuine, if uneven, development Potemkin actually pursued in the region. To the west, Catherine participated with Prussia and Austria in 3 successive partitions of Poland-Lithuania in 1772, 1793, and 1795 that progressively dismantled the neighboring Commonwealth entirely, with the final partition erasing it from the map as an independent state and bringing large populations of Poles, Lithuanians, and Jews under Russian imperial rule for the first time, along with the administrative and religious complications that absorbing them would create for the empire's governance over the following century. That restlessness came to a head within weeks of Alexander's own death in late 1825, when confusion over the succession between his 2 surviving brothers created a brief window several officers, many organized for years already into secret societies debating constitutional reform, chose to exploit. On a December morning in St. Petersburg's Senate Square, a group of these officers led several thousand soldiers in refusing to swear allegiance to the new Tsar, Nicholas I, demanding instead a constitution and, in some accounts, confusing the ordinary troops present into believing they were shouting support for Constantine's wife, whom they mistook for a constitution itself. The revolt collapsed within hours under artillery fire ordered by Nicholas personally, and the ringleaders, later known as the Decembrists, were either executed or sentenced to Siberian exile, several accompanied voluntarily into that exile by wives who became, in later Russian cultural memory, celebrated symbols of loyalty and sacrifice. Nicholas drew from this failed uprising a lesson that shaped his entire 30-year reign. Any concession toward constitutional government represented an existential threat to the throne itself. He expanded a secret police apparatus, the Third Section, tightened censorship, and adopted as an official doctrine what his minister Sergei Uvarov termed official nationality, resting state legitimacy on 3 pillars: autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality, a formula explicitly designed to reject the constitutional and revolutionary currents then reshaping Western Europe. Nicholas's rigid conservatism did not prevent catastrophe abroad. Russia's involvement in the Crimean War, beginning in 1853, pitted the empire against an Ottoman-British-French coalition and exposed, with humiliating clarity, how far Russian military technology and logistics had fallen behind Western Europe's industrializing powers. Russian sailing ships proved outmatched by British and French steam vessels, and reports reaching St. Petersburg from the siege of Sevastopol described chronic shortages of modern weapons, medical supplies, and even functioning rail transport to move troops and provisions to the front. Nicholas died in 1855, before the war's conclusion, and Russia's eventual defeat, formalized the following year, left his successor, Alexander II, confronting an uncomfortable truth. An empire that still depended on millions of unfree peasant laborers could not compete militarily with states whose economies had begun moving decisively beyond that model. Alexander II's response, developed over several years of internal debate among reform-minded officials, produced the single most consequential domestic policy shift since Peter's reign, the Emancipation Manifesto of 1861, formally ending serfdom for tens of millions of peasants across the empire. The reform's practical terms, though, fell considerably short of the freedom many peasants expected. Former serfs were required to pay redemption payments, spread over decades, to compensate landowners for the land allotted to them, payments many considered a continuation of bondage under a different name, and the amount of land actually transferred frequently proved smaller and of poorer quality than what peasants had previously worked, generating disappointment and, in some regions, open unrest in the reform's immediate aftermath. Emancipation was followed by a broader wave of reforms addressing local government, the judiciary, and military conscription, including the establishment of zemstvo councils, granting limited local self-governance, and a judicial overhaul introducing jury trials and greater procedural consistency. Yet these changes substantial as they were by the standards of previous Romanov rule, did nothing to satisfy a new generation of radicalized thinkers who had concluded that incremental reform, administered from above, could never resolve Russia's fundamental inequities. Populist movements in the 1870s sent thousands of young, educated Russians into the countryside in an effort known as going to the people, attempting to raise peasant political consciousness directly, an effort that largely failed against peasant indifference or suspicion and pushed some of the movement's more impatient adherents toward organized political violence instead. One such organization, the People's Will, dedicated itself explicitly to Tsaricide as a catalyst for revolution, and after several failed attempts, succeeded in March of 1881, killing Alexander II with a bomb thrown as his carriage traveled through St. Petersburg, only one day after he had reportedly approved, in principle, a modest consultative reform that some historians speculate might have edged Russia toward limited constitutional government had it survived him. His son, Alexander III, drew the opposite conclusion from his father's assassination and pursued a program of reaction rather than continued reform, reversing several of the Zemstvo reform's more liberal provisions, tightening press censorship further, and pursuing an aggressive policy of Russification aimed at suppressing the cultural and linguistic distinctiveness of Poles, Finns, and other non-Russian peoples within the empire. His reign also saw intensified state-tolerated violence against Jewish communities, particularly following the assassination, with waves of pogroms breaking out across parts of the empire, often with local authorities making little effort to intervene, driving mass emigration that would send millions of Russian Jews abroad over the following decades. By the close of the 19th century, the contradictions accumulating across this entire period, an economy industrializing rapidly in select urban centers, even as the countryside remained impoverished, an educated class increasingly exposed to revolutionary and constitutional ideas, even as the autocracy refused to cede any formal political power, and a rapidly growing industrial working class crowded into cities with few legal protections or outlets for grievance, had produced a state whose stability rested less on genuine social cohesion than on police repression, and a growing gap between what its subjects were beginning to demand and what its rulers were willing to concede. That gap would not remain merely theoretical much longer. Within the first years of the coming century, it would erupt into open revolution, suppressed once more, but never again fully extinguished, setting the stage for a war that would finally overwhelm the autocracy's capacity to hold the contradiction together at all. That eruption arrived first in January of 1905, when a peaceful crowd of workers and their families, led by an Orthodox priest named Georgy Gapon, marched toward the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to present Tsar Nicholas II, who had succeeded his father Alexander III in 1894, with a petition for basic labor protections and civil rights. Imperial troops opened fire on the unarmed procession, killing and wounding a number contemporary estimates place in the hundreds, an event that became known as Bloody Sunday, and that shattered, almost overnight, whatever residual popular faith remained in the Tsar as a paternal protector, standing above and apart from his own repressive bureaucracy. The unrest that followed spread with a speed the autocracy struggled to contain. Strikes swept industrial centers. Peasant disturbances erupted across the countryside, and in St. Petersburg, workers organized a council, a soviet, to coordinate strike action independent of any state-sanctioned institution, a model that would recur with far greater consequence 12 years later. Facing a general strike that had paralyzed the empire's economy by autumn, Nicholas reluctantly issued the October Manifesto, promising an elected legislative body, the Duma, along with basic civil liberties, a concession that split the opposition between moderates willing to work within the new constitutional framework and revolutionaries who regarded it as an inadequate half-measure designed to blunt rather than satisfy popular demands. The Duma that convened over the following years proved chronically constrained. Nicholas retained the right to dissolve it, altered the electoral law in 1907 to favor propertied and conservative representation, after the first two Dumas proved too confrontational for his liking, and continued to regard the entire arrangement as a temporary concession rather than a genuine transfer of authority. Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, appointed in the reform's immediate aftermath, pursued an agrarian program intended to create a class of independent peasant landowners loyal to the state, a policy some historians credit with genuine long-term potential. Had it been given decades rather than the few years Stolypin actually had before his assassination in 1911 by a revolutionary with, confusingly, apparent ties to the secret police as well. Whatever stabilizing effect these reforms might eventually have produced was overtaken entirely by the outbreak of general European war in August of 1914. Russia's mobilization in support of Serbia against Austria-Hungary and the resulting German declaration of war drew the empire into a conflict for which its military logistics, still hampered by the same infrastructural weaknesses the Crimean War had exposed 6 decades earlier, proved badly unprepared. Early campaigns produced disaster on a scale that shocked the public. At Tannenberg, in August 1914, an entire Russian army was effectively destroyed by German forces, its commanding general reportedly taking his own life rather than report the defeat. And by 1915, the army was suffering shortages so severe that soldiers at the front were, according to multiple contemporary accounts, sometimes sent into combat without rifles, expected to arm themselves from fallen comrades. Nicholas's decision in September of 1915 to assume personal command of the army at the front, intended as a gesture of resolve, instead removed him from the capital, at precisely the moment domestic administration required firm oversight, leaving effective governance in the hands of his wife, Empress Alexandra, whose German birth already made her an object of public suspicion, and whose reliance on the controversial mystic Grigory Rasputin as a spiritual advisor, credited by the imperial couple with easing the suffering of their hemophiliac son, but viewed by much of the court and public as evidence of the monarchy's advancing dysfunction, further corroded the dynasty's remaining prestige. Rasputin's murder in December of 1916, carried out by a group of conservative nobles who hoped his removal might yet save the monarchy's reputation, changed nothing about the underlying strain the war had placed on Russian society. By early 1917, wartime economic dislocation had produced severe food and fuel shortages in the capital, now renamed Petrograd, amid wartime anti-German sentiment. And in late February, bread shortages, combined with International Women's Day demonstrations, to spark strikes that spread rapidly through the city's factories. When the garrison troops ordered to suppress the unrest instead mutinied and joined the demonstrators, the Tsarist government's last coercive instrument dissolved within days, and Nicholas, attempting to return to the capital by train, found his route blocked and his own generals recommending abdication as the only means of preserving any stability at all. He abdicated on the 2nd of March, 1917, initially in favor of his son, and then, reconsidering the boy's fragile health, in favor of his brother, who himself declined the throne the following day, bringing the 3-century Romanov dynasty to an end without a single shot fired in its final defense. What replaced the monarchy was not a single stable authority, but an uneasy dual structure, a provisional government, drawn largely from the old Duma's liberal and moderate factions, and led eventually by Alexander Kerensky, claiming formal governing authority, alongside the Petrograd Soviet, the same council model workers had improvised in 1905, now reconstituted and commanding genuine loyalty among soldiers and industrial workers that the provisional government itself conspicuously lacked. This arrangement, sometimes termed dual power by historians, left Russia with 2 competing centers of authority, neither strong enough to govern alone, and the provisional government's fateful decision to continue the deeply unpopular war effort, rather than seek immediate peace, would, within months, hand a small, disciplined revolutionary faction the opening it needed to seize what dual power had left dangerously undecided. The faction positioned to exploit that opening was the Bolsheviks, a Marxist party led by Vladimir Lenin, who had spent most of the preceding decade in European exile, and returned to Petrograd in April of 1917 with German logistical assistance, the German High Command calculating, correctly as it turned out, that a revolutionary agitator committed to withdrawing Russia from the war served their own strategic interests. Lenin's April theses, published immediately upon his arrival, rejected any cooperation with the provisional government outright and called instead for Soviets to seize power directly, a position that placed the Bolsheviks well to the left of most other socialist factions, still willing to work within the provisional government's framework. Through the following months, the provisional government's authority eroded steadily. An offensive launched in June under the government's war minister collapsed disastrously, further discrediting the policy of continued fighting, and in July, an attempted Bolshevik-adjacent uprising in Petrograd, suppressed by forces still loyal to Kerensky, briefly drove Lenin into hiding in Finland. The government's position weakened further in late August, when its own commander-in-chief, General Lava Kornilov, attempted to march on Petrograd, in what Kerensky and Kornilov each later described differently, either as a coup against the government or as a response to a miscommunicated request for support against the Bolsheviks, but which in either case forced Kerensky to arm the very Bolshevik-aligned workers he had suppressed weeks earlier in order to defend the capital, inadvertently rebuilding the armed Bolshevik militia network that had been dismantled after the July crisis. By October, with the Petrograd garrison and the Baltic fleet increasingly sympathetic to Bolshevik agitation, Lenin, having returned secretly to the capital, pushed his reluctant party leadership toward an armed seizure of power ahead of an upcoming Congress of Soviets, calculating that presenting the Congress with power already transferred would be far more effective than waiting for a vote. On the night of the 24th to 25th of October, by the old Russian calendar, Bolshevik-aligned Red Guards and soldiers seized key installations across Petrograd with minimal resistance, and the provisional government, its ministers arrested inside the Winter Palace after a defense contemporary accounts describe as almost farcically weak, collapsed within hours rather than days. The ease of the Bolshevik seizure in the capital did not translate into control over the wider country, and the following years produced a civil war of extraordinary brutality and geographic scope. Opposition to Bolshevik rule coalesced into what became loosely known as the White Forces, an ideologically fractured coalition of monarchists, liberals, and moderate socialists, united mainly by opposition to Bolshevism rather than any shared political program, and operating from multiple fronts simultaneously across Siberia, southern Russia, and the northwest, with foreign powers including Britain, France, the United States, and Japan providing varying degrees of material support and, in some regions, direct military intervention aimed at reopening the Eastern Front against Germany and, increasingly, at containing Bolshevism itself. Leon Trotsky, appointed to organize Bolshevik military resistance, built the Red Army from a negligible improvised force into a disciplined fighting force, numbering, by the war's later stages, in the millions, employing former imperial officers under close political supervision alongside newly trained Bolshevik commanders. The war's violence extended well beyond conventional battle lines. Both Red and White forces conducted mass executions of captured opponents and suspected sympathizers, and the Bolshevik government formalized a policy of deliberate terror through the Cheka, its secret police, explicitly justified by leading Bolsheviks as a necessary instrument for eliminating class enemies rather than an unfortunate excess of wartime conditions. Amid this chaos, in July of 1918, Nicholas II, his wife, and their 5 children were executed by local Bolshevik authorities in Yekaterinburg, acting, historians generally agree, based on surviving correspondence, with at least the tacit approval of the central leadership in Moscow, out of fear that advancing White or Czech forces might liberate the former Tsar and provide White forces with a unifying symbol. The Civil War's economic toll compounded its direct violence enormously. The Bolshevik government's war communism policy, involving forced grain requisitioning from the peasantry to feed cities and the army, provoked widespread peasant resistance and contributed directly to a catastrophic famine across the Volga region in 1921 and 1922, with death toll estimates, though contested and imprecise given the period's chaotic record-keeping, plausibly running into the millions, a disaster severe enough that the Bolshevik government took the unusual step of accepting international famine relief, including a substantial American relief operation. That leader who would push the party's precedent for terror to its furthest extreme was Joseph Stalin, whose rise following Lenin's death in January of 1924 owed less to ideological brilliance, which rivals like Trotsky possessed in far greater visible measure, than to Stalin's control, as party general secretary, over appointments and internal party machinery, a bureaucratic position he used methodically to place loyalists throughout the apparatus, while his more prominent rivals underestimated him as a mere administrator. By outmaneuvering Trotsky and a shifting series of other alliances within the Politburo through the mid-1920s, Stalin had secured effective control of the party well before the decade's end, and Trotsky himself was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1929, eventually murdered by a Stalinist agent in Mexico over a decade later. Stalin's economic program marked a sharp reversal of Lenin's pragmatic market concessions. Beginning with the first five-year plan in 1928, the state committed to breakneck industrialization, targeting enormous increases in steel, coal, and machinery output within impossibly compressed timeframes. Funded substantially by forcing agricultural output out of the peasantry through collectivization, the consolidation of individual peasant farms into state-controlled collective units. Peasant resistance to losing their land and livestock was met with mass deportation of those classified as kulaks, a loosely and often arbitrarily applied label for supposedly wealthier peasants, with historians estimating those deported to remote regions or forced labor in the low millions, a substantial proportion of whom died from the conditions of transport and exile itself. Collectivization's most catastrophic consequence unfolded across 1932 and 1933, when grain requisition quotas set by Moscow, often based on wildly unrealistic production estimates and enforced with lethal rigidity, even as local officials reported starvation conditions, produced a famine that struck Ukraine, the North Caucasus, and Kazakhstan with particular severity. In Ukraine, where the famine is remembered as the Holodomor, some historians and several national governments have concluded the policy amounted to a deliberate act of genocide targeting Ukrainian peasants specifically, while others argue the famine, though certainly worsened by deliberate policy choices, including continued grain exports, amid starvation and restrictions, preventing peasants from fleeing affected areas, primarily reflected catastrophic ideological rigidity applied uniformly, rather than ethnic targeting alone. This remains one of the most contested questions in the era's historiography. Death toll estimates across the broader famine vary considerably, depending on region and methodology, with credible scholarly figures for Ukraine alone commonly falling in a range of several million. Industrialization's human toll extended beyond the famine into the labor camp system itself. The Gulag network of forced labor camps, expanding enormously through the 1930s, supplied labor for major infrastructure projects, including canal and rail construction, with mortality rates in the harshest camps, particularly in Arctic and Siberian locations, reaching levels contemporary survivor accounts and later archival research both describe as horrific. Though total Gulag death figures across the system's entire history remain a matter of ongoing scholarly revision, as archives have opened and closed to researchers at different points. Stalin's paranoia, always present, escalated dramatically following the assassination of Leningrad party boss Sergei Kirov in December of 1934, an event some historians suspect, without conclusive proof, Stalin himself may have orchestrated as a pretext for the purges that followed. What is documented with far greater certainty is what came next, the Great Terror of 1937 and 1938, during which show trials eliminated virtually the entire remaining generation of senior Bolshevik leadership, prominent figures including Nikolai Bukharin confessing under duress to fantastical charges of espionage and sabotage before their execution, while the terror simultaneously swept far beyond the party elite into the military officer corps, ordinary professionals, and countless individuals denounced by neighbors, colleagues, or family members, acting from genuine belief, personal grievance, or simple self-preservation. Archival records opened after the Soviet collapse indicate that during these 2 years alone, well over 700,000 people were executed, a figure that stunned even historians who had long assumed the terror's toll to be severe, though some scholars continue to debate the precision of archival categorization for this period. That catastrophically depleted command structure was tested within just 3 years, though the invasion, when it came, followed a period of uneasy and ultimately illusory accommodation between Stalin and the power he would soon find himself fighting for survival against. In August of 1939, Stalin's government signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, containing secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, an arrangement that permitted the Soviet Union to annex the Baltic states, eastern Poland, and portions of Romania over the following 2 years, while Germany turned its attention westward, and that left Stalin, according to multiple later accounts from within his own circle, dismissing repeated intelligence warnings of an impending German attack as provocations meant to draw the Soviet Union into premature conflict. That confidence proved catastrophically misplaced. On the 22nd of June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, committing over 3 million soldiers along a front stretching the length of the Western Soviet border, the largest invasion force in military history to that point, and Soviet defenses, undermined by Stalin's own refusal to authorize full mobilization in the days immediately preceding the attack, collapsed with stunning speed. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed in the war's opening months, with German forces claiming hundreds of thousands of prisoners in single encirclement battles around Kiev and Smolensk, and by autumn, German units stood within sight of Moscow's outer suburbs, close enough that some government offices had already begun evacuating the capital eastward toward the Ural region. Moscow held, aided by an unusually early and severe winter that stalled the German advance, and by the arrival of fresh, well-equipped Siberian divisions transferred west. Once Soviet intelligence confirmed Japan had no immediate intention of attacking from the east. Instead, the city's survival, though hard-fought and far from assured through the tensest weeks of late 1941, marked the war's first major strategic setback for German planners, who had counted on a rapid collapse of Soviet resistance rather than a grinding multi-year campaign across a front of this scale. The war's most decisive turning point arrived a year later, at Stalingrad, where German forces, driving toward the Caucasus oil fields, became locked from late summer 1942 through the following winter in brutal, building-by-building urban combat for a city that had become, for both Hitler and Stalin, a matter of prestige extending well beyond its practical strategic value. Soviet forces under General Georgy Zhukov executed a coordinated encirclement, Operation Uranus, in November 1942, trapping the German Sixth Army entirely within the city's ruins, and the German forces' surrender in February 1943, after months of starvation and cold that killed tens of thousands of encircled soldiers before the surrender itself, marked the first time an entire German field army had been destroyed in the war, a psychological and strategic blow from which German offensive capacity in the east never fully recovered. The war's remaining 2 years saw Soviet forces steadily reverse the front, winning the massive armored engagement at Kursk in the summer of 1943, the largest tank battle in history, and pushing German forces back through Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland over the following 2 years toward Berlin itself, which Soviet forces captured in a final, ferocious battle in the spring of 1945 that left much of the city in ruins and ended, within days, with Hitler's suicide and Germany's unconditional surrender. The human cost the Soviet Union bore in achieving this victory, dwarfs, by any measure, the losses of every other major combatant nation in the war. Modern scholarly estimates, though still subject to some revision as archival research continues, place total Soviet deaths, military and civilian combined, at roughly 27 million, encompassing combat losses, the deliberate starvation of besieged cities such as Leningrad, where a blockade lasting nearly 900 days killed civilians by the hundreds of thousands through cold and hunger, and the systematic killing of civilians, particularly Jewish populations, across German-occupied. A Leningrad resident's diary from the siege's worst winter, later published and widely cited by historians, recorded in flat, exhausted prose the deaths of family members, one after another, within the same cramped apartment, a document historians regard as one of the starkest surviving testimonies of the siege's civilian toll. Stalin died in March of 1953, and the collective leadership that briefly followed his death soon yielded to Nikita Khrushchev, who moved within 3 years to distance the party from its founder's legacy in dramatic fashion. In a closed session of the 20th Party Congress in February 1956, Khrushchev delivered a lengthy speech detailing Stalin's crimes, the fabricated purges, the destruction of the military's own officer corps, the cult of personality built around a single leader, in terms that shocked delegates present, some of whom reportedly required medical attention during the address itself. The speech, though officially secret, spread rapidly through party channels and eventually abroad, initiating a period Soviet citizens came to call the thaw, marked by the release of large numbers of Gulag prisoners, a modest loosening of censorship that allowed works like Alexander Solzhenitsyn's account of camp life to be published domestically for the first time, and a general, if uneven and frequently reversed, relaxation of the terror's most extreme mechanisms. Khrushchev's reign also produced genuine technological triumph that briefly convinced much of the world Soviet development had outpaced its capitalist rival, the launch of Sputnik in October 1957, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth, followed 4 years later by Yuri Gagarin's flight, the first human spaceflight in history, achievements that generated real alarm in Washington over a perceived missile and technology gap, and that remain, in Russian national memory, among the era's most genuinely celebrated accomplishments, regardless of how one judges the system that produced them. That same technological confidence, however, nearly produced catastrophe in October 1962, when Khrushchev's decision to station nuclear missiles in Cuba within striking range of the American mainland brought the Soviet Union and the United States to the closest point of direct nuclear confrontation either power would reach during the entire Cold War, resolved only after tense secret negotiations that saw Khrushchev withdraw the missiles in exchange for a private American commitment to remove its own missiles from Turkey, and a public pledge not to invade Cuba. The crisis's resolution, while avoiding war, damaged Khrushchev's standing within his own Politburo, whose members already resented his unpredictable governing style and his disruptive de-Stalinization campaign. And in October 1964, while Khrushchev vacationed away from Moscow, his colleagues voted to remove him from power entirely, replacing him with a considerably more cautious figure, Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev's 18-year tenure, the longest of any Soviet leader after Stalin, came to define an era later Soviet reformers would openly label stagnation, a period in which the dynamism of Khrushchev's thaw gave way to a comfortable, risk-averse bureaucratic conservatism. Economic growth, robust through the 1960s, slowed markedly through the following decade, as the centrally planned system, well-suited to mobilizing resources for heavy industry and military production, proved increasingly incapable of matching Western consumer economies in efficiency, technological innovation, or the production of ordinary goods citizens actually wanted to buy, producing chronic shortages of consumer items that became a defining, wearily accepted feature of everyday Soviet life. Brezhnev's foreign policy pursued a doctrine articulated explicitly after Soviet-led forces crushed the Prague Spring reform movement in Czechoslovakia in August 1968, holding that the Soviet Union retained the right to intervene militarily in any socialist state whose government appeared to be drifting from orthodox communist control, a principle that preserved the Eastern Bloc's outward unity through coercion while deepening resentment among populations across Eastern Europe that would resurface with force decades later. The Soviet military buildup continued regardless, reaching rough nuclear and conventional parity with the United States. By the decade's end, even as the civilian economy underlying that buildup grew steadily less capable of sustaining it. That overextension reached its most costly expression in December 1979, when Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan to prop up a faltering communist government there, a commitment Brezhnev's aging leadership anticipated would be brief, but that instead settled into a grinding 9-year counterinsurgency against Mujahideen fighters, who received substantial covert funding and weaponry, including shoulder-fired missiles that proved devastating against Soviet aircraft from the United States. And the war's cost in Soviet soldiers' lives, estimated at roughly 15,000 dead over its full course, was compounded by a much larger toll among Afghan civilians and combatants. And the conflict became, within the Soviet Union itself, an increasingly unpopular drain that domestic media, still tightly controlled, struggled to fully conceal from a public growing weary of returning coffins and unexplained absences. Brezhnev's death in November 1982 initiated a rapid succession of aging, ailing leaders, Yuri Andropov and then Konstantin Chernenko, each dying within roughly a year of assuming office, a pattern that left the Soviet Union's senior leadership visibly and, to much of the watching world, almost absurdly incapable of managing a modernizing global economy or a restless, increasingly informed population. By the time the Politburo turned, in March 1985, to a considerably younger and more energetic candidate, the accumulated weight of economic stagnation, an unwinnable foreign war, and a leadership gerontocracy that had become an international symbol of institutional exhaustion, had already made clear to reform-minded officials within the party that the system Stalin had built and Brezhnev had preserved could not continue indefinitely along its existing course without some fundamental change, though few among even its most convinced reformers yet grasped how completely that attempt at change was about to unravel the entire structure it was meant to save. That younger candidate was Mikhail Gorbachev, and he arrived in office already convinced. Based on years of experience touring an agricultural sector he knew intimately to be underperforming, that the Soviet system required structural change rather than another round of cosmetic personnel shuffling. His initial reforms, glasnost, a policy of expanded openness and reduced censorship, and perestroika, a broader restructuring of economic management intended to introduce limited market mechanisms and enterprise autonomy within a still socialist framework, were conceived as tools to revitalize the existing system, not to dismantle it, a distinction Gorbachev himself maintained consistently, even as events increasingly slipped beyond what either policy had been designed to control. Glasnost's effects proved far more immediate and destabilizing than perestroika's slower economic adjustments. Newspapers and television, released from decades of rigid ideological control, began publishing investigations into previously forbidden subjects. The true scale of Stalin's terror, the hidden costs of the Afghan war, and, most consequentially, long-suppressed nationalist grievances among the Soviet Union's numerous non-Russian republics, whose populations had spent decades under enforced narratives of harmonious, multinational unity that Glasnost's new candor now allowed to be openly questioned for the first time. That candor turned catastrophic in April 1986, when a reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine exploded during a botched safety test, releasing radioactive contamination across a wide swath of Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond. The initial government response followed old habits of concealment, delaying public acknowledgement for days, even as radiation levels spiked and nearby populations remained unevacuated, a failure Gorbachev himself later described as a turning point that exposed, more starkly than any single economic statistic could, how deeply institutional secrecy and bureaucratic self-protection had corroded the state's basic capacity to protect its own citizens, and the disaster's mishandling accelerated Gorbachev's own commitment to expanding glasnost's reach, rather than retreating from it. Perestroika's economic measures, meanwhile, produced a difficult transitional period without delivering the improved living standards Gorbachev had promised. Limited enterprise autonomy and reduced central planning disrupted established supply chains without yet establishing functioning market alternatives, and consumer shortages, already a chronic feature of Soviet life, worsened noticeably through the late 1980s, feeding public frustration that glasnost's newly opened media now had full license to report rather than suppress. Nationalist movements, emboldened by the new openness and by Gorbachev's evident reluctance to reimpose Brezhnev-era repression, gathered momentum rapidly across the Baltic republics, the Caucasus, and Ukraine through 1988 and 1989. Estonia's parliament asserted the primacy of its own laws over Soviet law in late 1988, an act other republics soon echoed in various forms. And in August 1989, an estimated 2 million people formed a continuous human chain across Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, marking the anniversary of the secret protocols that had brought the Baltic states under Soviet control half a century earlier, a demonstration of coordinated peaceful defiance on a scale the Soviet security apparatus, still capable of violent suppression as later events would show, chose on this occasion not to confront directly. The Soviet Union's external empire unraveled even faster than its internal one. Gorbachev, having concluded that propping up unpopular communist governments across Eastern Europe by force, in the manner Brezhnev's doctrine had once mandated, was no longer sustainable or desirable, signaled clearly through 1989 that Moscow would not intervene militarily to save Allied regimes from their own populations. Poland's communist government negotiated its own peaceful transfer of power to the Solidarity opposition movement that summer. Hungary dismantled its border fortifications with Austria shortly after, and in November 1989, the Berlin Wall, the Cold War's most enduring physical symbol, fell within hours, as East German authorities, overwhelmed by crowds and confused internal signals, opened crossings that had been sealed for nearly 3 decades. Communist governments across Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania collapsed or were violently overthrown within weeks of each other that same winter. And by the close of 1989, the Eastern Bloc that Stalin's armies had established at staggering cost 4 decades earlier had ceased to exist as a Soviet-aligned system almost entirely. That confrontation arrived on the 19th of August, 1991, when a group of senior hardline officials, including the vice president, the defense minister, and the head of the KGB, placed Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation residence in Crimea and announced, via state television, the formation of an emergency committee assuming control of the country to halt what they characterized as the reform era's descent into chaos. Tanks moved into central Moscow that morning, and for a tense several days, the outcome hung genuinely in doubt. Resistance to the coup coalesced not around Gorbachev, isolated and unreachable in Crimea, but around Boris Yeltsin, who defied the coup plotters openly, famously climbing atop a tank outside the Russian parliament building to denounce the takeover before a crowd of supporters and journalists, an image broadcast internationally within hours, and one that instantly reframed the confrontation as a contest between an entrenched old guard and an elected reformist leader defending popular sovereignty. Crucial military units wavered rather than firing on the tens of thousands of civilians who gathered to defend the parliament building, and by the 21st of August, the coup collapsed, its leaders arrested, and Gorbachev returned to Moscow to find that the crisis had transformed the political landscape entirely, leaving Yeltsin, not Gorbachev, in possession of the authority and popular legitimacy the moment had actually decided. The economic strain that had built through the perestroika years, the political fragmentation, the Baltic and other republics had spent nearly 2 years pursuing, and the collapse of public faith in communist ideology that Glasnost's revelations had accelerated, now converged simultaneously, rather than unfolding as separate, sequential crises. Within days of the coup's failure, Gorbachev resigned as General Secretary of the Communist Party and suspended its activities entirely, stripping the institution that had governed the country without serious internal challenge for 7 decades of any remaining authority in a single stroke. Republic after republic, watching the central government's evident weakness, moved swiftly to declare formal independence over the following months, Ukraine's referendum in December returning an overwhelming majority in favor of leaving the Union entirely, a result that removed any remaining possibility of preserving even a reduced federal structure. On the 8th of December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met at a hunting lodge in the Belovezha forest and signed an agreement declaring the Soviet Union simply ceased to exist as a subject of international law, replacing it with a loose commonwealth of independent states that carried no meaningful central authority of its own. Gorbachev, president of a country whose constituent parts had just voted it out of existence without consulting him directly, had no practical means of objecting, and on Christmas Day, 1991, he appeared on television to announce his resignation as the first and last president of the Soviet Union. That evening, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the final time and replaced by the Russian tricolor, a quiet, almost administrative, close to a state whose founding, 7 decades earlier, had been anything but quiet. What emerged from the wreckage was a Russian federation facing economic dislocation on a scale its citizens had not experienced since the Civil War era, 7 decades before. Price liberalization in early 1992 triggered hyperinflation that wiped out ordinary citizens' savings within months. A rushed privatization program transferred vast state industrial and energy assets into private hands, under circumstances many economists and ordinary Russians alike came to regard as deeply corrupt, producing a small class of enormously wealthy oligarchs, even as broad measures of public health, life expectancy, and basic living standards deteriorated sharply. Yeltsin's own authority frayed under these pressures, culminating in a violent constitutional crisis in October 1993, when he ordered tanks to shell his own parliament building after a standoff with legislators opposed to his reforms. An episode that left the new Russian state's democratic institutions bearing scars from their very first years of existence. The empire's dissolution left unresolved tensions that would outlast the decade entirely. Chechnya's attempt to separate from the Russian Federation triggered a brutal war beginning in 1994 that devastated its capital, Grozny, and left thousands dead without securing a lasting settlement, a conflict that would recur in a second, even more destructive phase before the decade's end. And the millions of ethnic Russians left stranded in newly independent states, carved from the old Union's territory, along with the abrupt loss of superpower status that had defined Soviet identity for 2 generations, left a residue of resentment and disorientation that would shape Russian politics and its relationship with its former Soviet neighbors for decades to come. What remains today of the arc that began with frightened river valley tribes seeking basic protection against tribal feud and steppe tribute demands is a landscape littered with the physical and institutional traces of every phase that followed. The Kremlin walls, Ivan III's Italian architects, raised now enclosing a very different government than the one that commissioned them. St. Petersburg's canals and palaces still bearing the ruinous human cost of Peter's forced construction, the mass graves beneath Kiev and Novgorod alike standing as quiet testimony to invasions and terrors, separated by 7 centuries, but joined by a common thread of catastrophic vulnerability on an open, undefended plain. Historians continue to debate whether that geography, a homeland with no natural walls, produced a political culture inclined towards centralized, coercive authority as the only available guarantee of survival, or whether that same authority, exercised across 1,000 years by princes, czars, and general secretaries alike, created the very insecurity it claimed to be defending against. What is not in serious dispute is that the plain itself remains, indifferent to whichever answer historians eventually settle on, still open, still vast, and still, as it was for the tribes who first gathered along its river valleys, a place where the search for security and the temptation of total control have never yet been fully separated from one another.